Chapter 5, The American Revolution, from Gentry Protest to Popular Revolt, 1763 to 1783. Between 1763 and 1783, Americans increasingly rebelled against English rule, declared independence, and finally won the military struggle against the British, establishing the United States of America. Structure of colonial society. At the end of the 7 Years' War, American society on the whole was young, optimistic, and prosperous, and Americans looked to the future with considerable political and economic expectations. They did not expect revolution or look forward to national independence. Breakdown of political trust. Through the mounting conflict that culminated in 1776, King George III, his ministers, and Parliament based their stance on inaccurate information from the colonies while stubbornly defending Parliament's sovereign supreme power over every part of the dominions of state. It was clear that the colonists and individuals in England did not understand each other or the stakes at hand, and soon compromise became difficult. No taxation without representation, the American perspective. The political conflict that emerged after the 7 Years' War forced the Americans to refine their views on power of colonial assemblies, the meaning of representative government, and the freedom from England's revenue taxation. Ideas about power and virtue. Although many of the political ideals of American colonists were based on the traditions and theories of John Locke and the Commonwealthmen, their ideology also included a heavy emphasis on religious and moral components that most likely emanated from the Great Awakening. American political ideology found power dangerous unless countered by virtue. To believers, political error resulted from corruption and sin. Eroding the bonds of empire. After the war with the French, the British maintained a large military presence in the colonies, which Americans opposed for two reasons. British troops failed to protect the thousands of Americans who died during uprisings by Native Americans in the backcountry, and after the proclamation of 1763 was issued, British troops obstructed Western settlement. Paying off the national debt. When Greenfield insisted that Americans help pay for these troops with new taxes and restrictions on trade, well-to-do Americans involved in commerce quickly protested it as a scheme that deprived the colonies of their right to assess their own taxes. Popular protest. The protest of gentlemen grew to a mass movement with the opposition to Britain's Stamp Act. Americans resisted in colonial assemblies, in an intercolonial congress, in the streets, and in an import boycott affected by the Sons of Liberty and by the newly mobilized colonial women. Failed attempts to save the empire. A new English government repealed the offensive Stamp Act while maintaining the principle of parliamentary supremacy, included in the right to revenue taxation, but the crisis had reduced American respect and loyalty for Britain's imperial office holders. Fueling the crisis. Townsend's new ministry tried new taxes on American imports and new enforcement mechanisms, including customs commissioners supported by admiralty courts. Americans resisted with a boycott, rituals of non-consumption, and circular letters suggesting ways to thwart the act. Fatal show of force. A British transfer of troops to Boston heightened tensions ever more, and the colonists again resisted. One confrontation with British troops resulted in the Boston Massacre, which became an effective propaganda tool for the American resistance. Parliament, now led by Lord North, tried to stem the tide of colonial agitation by dropping all of the Townsend duties except that on tea, which was left as a symbol of Parliament's sovereignty. Days of Old Order 1770 to 1773. A brief period of calm and apparent reconciliation followed the Boston Massacre, but the actions of corrupt imperial officials and the continued agitation of radicals through the establishment of committees of correspondence brought about a renewal of tensions. The final provocation, the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, a colonial response to the new English regulations known as the Tea Act, led to the Coercive Acts and American Rebellion. Steps towards independence. With the fighting begun, 55 American delegates from 12 of the colonies met in a Continental Congress, which Adams soon led into a radical stance which included forcible resistance to the Coercive Act and a boycott of British imports. Shots heard around the world. Before the Continental Congress reconvened, the first blows of the American Revolution fell at Lexington and Concord. Beginning the world over again. The fighting in Massachusetts led to a second Continental Congress that slowly took control of the American war effort. Though some delegates expressed indecision regarding independence, British action in the passage of the Prohibitory Acts and the emergence of Thomas Paine's common sense pushed them to a formal declaration. Fighting for independence. English military and economic power might have prevailed had it not been for the logistical problems Britain faced in putting down the Colonial Rebellion and the degree of American commitment to independence. Building a professional army. The Americans maintained a regular army to symbolize the new country's independence and to attract foreign support. At the same time, colonial militia controlled large areas of the country and compelled support for the Patriots' war effort. While many supported the Patriots, thousands of African American colonists, most of them slaves, took up arms for the British, hoping in their case to gain unalienable rights for their services. Testing the American will. Washington's army suffered several serious defeats in New York and New Jersey and was on the run by late 1776, with contemporaries predicting defeat. Times that try men's soul. In 1776, the Americans lost a series of battles in an unsuccessful attempt to prevent Howe from reaching Philadelphia. Victory in a year of defeat. In 1777, the Americans captured Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, but they lost again at Germantown before digging in for the winter at Valley Forge. The French alliance. Exploiting a protracted hostility between the British and the French, American diplomacy, led brilliantly by Benjamin Franklin, turned the American Rebellion into a much wider war by persuading the French to offer an alliance founded on their desire for revenge against the British. The final campaign. The final British Southern strategy let loose a fury. Americans, more determined than ever, dug in and won a final victory at Yorktown. The Loyalist dilemma. Many Americans remained loyal to the Crown, often because they feared independence would bring social disorder, which would threaten the very liberties for which their American patriot opponents fought. American hatred and British distrust forced almost 100,000 Loyalists into bitter fight with their homeland. Winning the peace. A highly talented American peace delegation that included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay negotiated a very successful treaty with the British, gaining not only independence but also very favorable boundary and important fishing rights. Having won the war for independence, the Americans still faced many difficulties in shaping a new Republican government, having closed but the first act of a great drama.